North Georgia is fortunate to be the home of portions of 4 major trails, including the Appalachian, the Benton-MacKaye, the Penn-Hote, and the Bartram Trails. These trails form the spine of a network of trails across the region. The trails are largely located within a 480 million-year-old chain of mountains called the Appalachians, which extend for 2,000 miles, forming a natural east to west barrier between the coastal plain and the interior of North America. The Bartram Trail follows the old Charlestown trade path between Charleston, South Carolina, and the Cherokee villages in North Carolina and Tennessee. In 1775, William Bartram, an explorer and botanist, took this path as he traveled to the village of Cowie, which is just outside present-day Franklin, North Carolina. Bartram explored territory in the states of North and South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. The most established section of the current hiking trail covers about 115 miles from North Georgia into North Carolina. It spans 35 miles in Georgia from the northern border in Rabun County to the western branch of the Chattooga River. The original trail passed through or nearby to the modern towns of Clayton, Georgia, and Franklin, North Carolina. The Benton-MacKaye Trail is a footpath nearly 300 miles long in the Appalachian Mountains, with about 82 miles in Georgia. It is named for Benton MacKaye, the Massachusetts forester and regional planner who promoted the idea for the Appalachian Trail in 1921. The Benton-MacKaye Trail was laid out in the 1980s by David Sherman, who is known as the father for the Benton-MacKaye Trail. He developed the idea for the Benton-MacKaye Trail, which follows one pathway in Benton-MacKaye's original plan for a trail through the area. David Sherman and several others championed the trail to its completion in 2005. The Appalachian Trail runs 2,190 miles through 14 states and has its southern terminus in Georgia. From 1930 to 1958, this terminus was located at Oglethorpe Mountain, but it was then moved to its current location on Springer Mountain. Roughly 78 miles of the Appalachian Trail are in Georgia. Benton-MacKaye was the driving force behind this trail, which he envisioned to become both an economic engine for communities located along the Appalachians and a place for workers in the big eastern coast cities to seek recreation. In 1929, the initial route of much of the AT in Georgia was laid out by Roy Osmer, a forester who felt empowered to develop the trail's route south of the Smoky Mountains. The Penn-Hote Trail, which is Creek for Turkey's Home, was made a national recreation trail in 1977. The Penn-Hote Trail is 335 miles long, with 169 miles in Georgia, running across the northwest portion of the state and into Alabama's Talladega National Forest. This trail was a dashed line on Benton-MacKaye's early map of the Appalachian Trail. A conservationist and lawyer, Michael Leonard, sparked the development of this trail, first in Alabama and then in Georgia. These 4 trails intersect each other and sometimes share a common footpath. For example, the Benton-MacKaye Trail shares a starting point on Springer Mountain with the Appalachian Trail and meets the Penn-Hote Trail close to the Cohutta Wildlife Wilderness area near Blue Ridge, Georgia. Likewise, the Bartram Trail reaches its highest point as it crosses the Appalachian Trail at 5,385-foot Wyabald in North Carolina. Now, we're going to hear from individuals who have played a significant role in developing and preserving these original trails in North Georgia. The Bartram Trail is not only the oldest of the 4 major trails, but as an old trading path, is also the trail that most likely follows portions of an older Native American trail. Who was William Bartram?
William Bartram was an 18th century explorer whose father was John Bartram, who was the only royal botanist that the colonies ever had. John Bartram, William's father, was a royal botanist under King George III. And it's a long, great, wonderful story about how William ended up being this explorer in the southern Appalachians and in the Southeast in general. But William was a talented artist and a talented botanist, and had traveled with his father John in the 1760s throughout the southern colonies, collecting new specimens for the crown. They discovered Franklinia alatomaha in 1763 while traveling in the Altamaha River Basin, for example. And Bartram and his father discovered a lot of different species that were, therefore unknown to science. So in the 1770s, William got a patronage from a doctor in England by the name of John Fothergill. And Fothergill basically served as Bartram's patron for almost 4 years, collecting plants and also drawing species and paintings and sending those back to Fothergill in England. So Bartram traveled all throughout the southern the southern colonies in the 1770s, collecting plants and sending those plants back to England.
What do we know about his journey?
In 1775, he ventured into Cherokee country, which was something that he and his father had not done. John and William stayed mainly along the coastal plain and some of the Piedmont in Georgia, in the St. Johns River Valley in Florida. William extended those travels much farther when he came back over a decade later to explore these colonies again. And this time his goal was to get up into the Cherokee, as they were described then, the Cherokee Mountains. So there were old trade paths that came into these mountains that had been probably crisscrossing this landscape for literally thousands of years. And so the main trade path that Bartram took to come into the mountains here in North Georgia was what was called the Old Charlestown Trade Path. And that Old Charlestown Trade Path came out of Charleston and went up around where modern-day Lake Keowee is now and crossed the Chattooga, where the Chattooga Old Fields is, and up War Woman Valley. And what was believed was where he crossed into Clayton was at Courthouse Gap, and he came down into where modern-day Clayton is today. And this area was called the Dividings because there were so many Indian trails that came into the modern-day town of Clayton, then Stokoe, that you basically made your decision where you were going. And William's destination was Cowetown. And so William entered into the Dividings, as they were called at the time, probably using a map made in 1764 by a British cartographer by the name of Thomas Mant, who had been a cartographer during the French and Indian Wars, had mapped out the southern Appalachian Mountains, the best that he could in the 1760s. So William was likely using the Mant map or one of several others of these mountains, but he was following old trade paths. And his route basically took him up the Little Tennessee Valley, through Mountain City, Georgia, over the Eastern Continental Divide, and down into modern-day Franklin, and Niquosi, as it was called at the time, and on to Cowetown.
Is the current path of the Bartram Trail like the original path Bartram took?
There's some very good, disputes on exactly where Bartram traveled in the mountains here. Primarily because of a guy named Lamar Marshall, who has kind of really spent more time, I think, analyzing Bartram's travels than anyone. I think Bartram's route through Georgia was probably fairly close to existing trade paths, and the route in Georgia now on the trail is fairly close to what those existing trade paths would have been then. So if you're walking the trail in Georgia, particularly out of War Woman Dell, up the Chattooga, out of when it first starts at Russell Bridge, you're following some of the original route. But when you get up on the Fishhawk Range, for example, or Scaly Mountain, Bartram didn't walk the Fishhawks. He went straight down a Little Tennessee Valley. So it's a very different route he would have walked in 1775. But you're still getting remnants of that, particularly up in the Nantahalas, when you hike down the Nantahala Gorge on the Bartram Trail and into the gorge, you're following Bartram's route pretty close right there. But the trail was built over a course of about 50 years. It's still, we're still building it. It's like an ongoing project all the time. But the trail is about 50 years old and was started in the 1970s. The actual trail is 110 miles long, and we have about probably close to 20 miles of approach trails that we have to take care of as well. So the trail was built to honor Bartram's time in these mountains.
What are some of the features of the Bartram Trail?
The southern terminus is right on the South Carolina state line. So if you know where Highway 28 is kind of forming the South Carolina-Georgia line there, on the, where 28 crosses the Chattooga at Russell Bridge, that's the southern terminus of the trail. Then it heads on up for 37 miles into North Carolina, up the Fishhawks, down in the Little Tennessee Valley, up the Nantahala and into the Nantahala Gorge, and then up Cheowa Bald. It crosses the AT at Waya Bald, and then on down into the gorge and back up. It intersects with the AT again on Cheowa Bald, and then that's the northern terminus of the trail. It's definitely lower gradient trail than it is in North Carolina, at much lower elevations. So in Georgia, you're along the Chattooga River for probably close to 20 miles of the trail. You're just kind of following the path of the Chattooga River. And then you turn to go up to War Woman Dell, and you start to get some elevation. So you're hiking up out of War Woman Dell up to the Pinnacle and Courthouse Gap, and from there you're going all the way up to Raven Bald. The trail coming out of War Woman Dell is a good question. I'm assuming there's always been some great trails up to Raven Bald, and it was just take advantage of those existing trails that were already there in those mountains, and some of those probably dated back, hundreds if not thousands of years.
Portions of the 2,100-mile Appalachian Trail already existed in 1921 when Benton MacKaye championed a trail running along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. The New England Trail Conference, which was a federation of 23 organizations, had already built and was caring for 1,072 miles of trail. However, the southern portions of the AT, as it became known, were emerging more slowly. In 1929, Roy Osmer laid out and blazed the first 700 miles of trail as he walked from Georgia towards Virginia. The beginnings of the trail in Georgia are well described in a book entitled Friendships of the Trail. This book lays out the history of the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club, which was formed in 1930. The AT, which was started in the South in 1922, was not completed from Georgia to Maine until August 17, 1937.
Attention to the trail was minimal at that time, and plus there was gas rationing, so you did not have gasoline to go drive anywhere that was not an absolute necessity. When the war ended and they started coming back, in particular Larry Freeman, who came back probably in 46, became a one-man force to get the trail and the club itself put back together. It was very splintered and very unorganized. And I think the bulletins had stopped, the newsletters had stopped, the trail work had stopped, and Larry was a very, very capable fellow.
I had illusions, I guess. I wanted to believe that the Appalachian Trail was actually following the routes of the Native American. And many days when we hike, we hike a little distance from each other. You just let your mind wander off and speak to these kinds of things. I don't know it for fact, but I hope there is some historical studies that will reveal whether or not, there are actually tracks along any of our trails that followed where the Native Americans did their daily activities.
The concept of a Benton MacKaye Trail was developed and promoted by David Sherman based on old maps from Benton MacKaye showing an alternative route through the southern Appalachians than that used by the AT. The construction of the BMT, as it is known, began in June 1980 and was completed in April 2005. The BMT starts in Georgia on Springer Mountain along with the AT and runs to the Cohutta Wilderness to Smoky Mountain National Park, and there again joins the AT at the northern end of Smoky Mountain National Park.
His name is David Sherman, and he is now considered the father of the Benton-MacKaye Trail. Because of him, it came about. He quit his job right a few months later with CNS Bank and got a job with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and he started hiking the Appalachian Trail and became totally engrossed in studying about it and about Benton-MacKaye, the founder of the Appalachian Trail.
When you looked at Benton-MacKaye's route for the trail and you plotted it on a USGS or a Forest Service map, it was clear that most of that land was already owned by the government. And so that, after having been involved in land acquisition with the other trails of the Appalachian Trail, that made it particularly appealing. There would be, we're starting from scratch, and I didn't know what scratch was. I didn't know whether we were going to form a club. I didn't know whether I could work with Margaret and get Georgia Appalachian Trail Club to take it over. In fact, we didn't even have a name for the trail. I was hesitant to name it the Benton-MacKaye Trail because there'd been such a very close relationship between Benton-MacKaye personally and members of the club, and I never wanted GATC to believe that this new trail was coming in to try and usurp their authority in their territory. So I was very sensitive to that, and I said, if I name it Benton-MacKaye Trail, it may cause some friction right there. So I had two other names. One was the Arnold-Guyot Trail, since Arnold-Guyot was the greatest explorer of the Appalachians in the antebellum period, and there's been nobody to rival him since. And also the Myron Avery Trail, because Myron Avery, of course, got the AT on the ground and built.
The Penn-Hote Trail cuts through portions of the Talladega Forest in Alabama, including the Odom Trail, built by the Boy Scouts in 1961, and includes 169 miles of trail in Georgia, where it eventually intersects the BMT about 2 miles south of Watson Gap.
So back in the 70s, my wife and I and my ex-scoutmaster started a hiking club in Birmingham, and it got pretty large. A lot of our hikes were in the Talladega National Forest, and there really weren't any trails there. There was a 10-mile trail called the Odom Scout Trail, and that was kind of it. And we would go there and walk on old logging roads that had been closed that we could find on a topo map. What that resulted in is going to Congress and getting a 6,000 acre wilderness set aside that was basically just everything around the Odom Scout Trail. So the idea was to take the Odom, to go south from there and to go north from there, and this whole thing would become the Penn-Hote Trail. So our club got involved in working on that project, dealing with the Forest Service to get approval and to do it. The original idea was to connect the actual end of the Appalachian Mountains, which is in Sylacauga, Alabama, not Springer Mountain, Georgia, was to connect it to the AT and either have the ATC recognize it as a section of the AT or just be a connector. So once the trail got completed in Alabama, then it just became, well, gee, let's go into Georgia and connect it up with the AT.
I think Michael and I started the Penn-Hote about the same time that we started the Benton-MacKaye Trail. But the next thing I know, Mike wants to join the Penn-Hote and then make those extensions of the Appalachian Trail. I thought Benton-MacKaye's dream of a trail that went down into the northern reaches of Georgia was fine, and we didn't need it crossing that valley and everything else to take it down to southern Alabama. Mike was in agreement, and ever since then, for 40 years, he's been working on that. It's pretty much Michael Leonard's trail.
So I think it was largely Michael Leonard's influence that said, well, you've got a very nice trail system here in Alabama, and you've got a concept that dates back to the 1920s that says, well, there's a little dash line on Benton-MacKaye's map that shows a connection from central Alabama to the Appalachian Trail. So he pushed that quite hard. Now, you may find organizations that have been more effective, but you'll probably not find a single individual that has been more effective in terms of conservation buying and trail development than Michael Leonard.
What does the name Penn Hote mean?
The Penn Hote name apparently was developed by the Forest Service, and depending on who you listen to, it means either turkey track or turkey feeding place, but it has to do with the turkey, and so the symbol became a turkey track.
The Penn Hote is a multi-use trail.
The Alabama portion was hiking only, and it does go through 2 wilderness areas, so that precludes mountain bike use and not so much horse use, but it has maintained its status in Alabama as a hiker-only trail. And there's a point, it's not exactly arbitrary, but it was a practical decision when it got into Georgia that sort of the hiker-only portion ended and the multi-use portion started. Now, the origins of multi-use in Georgia had to do with the appropriation that the Forest Service received. They said, well, we have demands for equestrian trails in our district, and we have demands for mountain bike trails in our district, and we cannot afford to build separate trails. So you user groups need to get together and learn to work together on this multi-use trail we're going to call the Penn Hote in Georgia.
Is the AT too short?
There was this situation back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where people thought, well, the Appalachian Trail just isn't long enough. And so they pieced together what they could of the Florida Trail, and then a road walk to get to the Penn Hote, and then the Penn Hote and the Benton MacKaye and the Appalachian Trail and the International Appalachian Trail. And there was a fellow from North Georgia that was planning on doing all of that. And then he found out before he ever got started that there was a guy that successfully did it before that. Well, the guy that did it, he had no real interest in the publicity on it. But there's a guy named M.J. Eberpart. He goes by the name Nimblewill Nomad. He is what we know to be the second person to do all of the Penn Hote, even though the Penn Hote wasn't complete.
The overall care and preservation of each of the major trails is a joint responsibility of the land managers, which may be private property owners or federal or state government, conservation groups, and trail associations. Under a volunteer management system, these 3 groups act like a 3-legged stool, providing the needed protection and preservation of the trails. As the song goes, what a wonderful world. We hope that you will hike at least part of one of the 4 major trails in North Georgia and experience the wonderful world that awaits you there. It will be an experience you will never forget.
Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through, just an old sweet song is Georgia on my mind. Georgia, Georgia, this song for you, it's as sweet and clear as moonlight through the pines. Other arms reach out to me. Other eyes smile tenderly. But still in peaceful dreams I see the road leads back to you. Georgia, Georgia, no peace do I find like an old sweet song. It's Georgia on my mind, yeah, yeah. On my mind, yeah, yeah. Georgia on my mind. Just an old sweet song, Georgia